Hey, thanks so much for having us today. I am Amy Washington. I am the executive director of the Northern Ohio chapter of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. And I have two of my colleagues with me today. I was hoping they could introduce themselves briefly before I go through the agenda.
Sure. Hi, I'm Russ Piborski. I'm the Director of IBD Ventures Investments for the foundation, and I actually live here in Cleveland, Ohio.
Hi, I'm Sarah Lewis. I'm the foundation's D&I director. I'm based in New York City, but I touch all areas of diversity and inclusion within the organization.
I think we can go to the next slide. And so I know that this is a smaller group today, so I'm hoping if anybody has questions, we can probably keep this pretty informal. I've asked Russ and Sarah to join me today because we are going over a range of topics. And so both of them are experts in their field. And Russ and Sarah, if either of you want to pop in on anything that I'm going over to share any insight, please feel free. So a few things that we'd like to cover today is just a basic overview of IBD and the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. Russ is going to give us a bit of a research update and talk about some gaps in research for our foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of our foundation. Sarah's going to talk about IBD in underserved communities. And then if we have some time, I'd love to share some local support and resources in our Northern Ohio chapter. And then of course, at the end, we'll have time for questions. Okay, so just on a very basic level, if you're not aware of what Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are, they are collectively inflammatory bowel disease, and the inflammation occurs in the GI tract. So at its very basic disrupts ability to adjust food for patients, and it can infect any part of the GI tract as it relates to Crohn's. So that can be mouth to anus, and ulcerative colitis is very specific to the colon or large intestine. Some of the symptoms of IBD, so there's a very wide range of symptoms, but the more common ones are diarrhea, rectal bleeding, fistulas, abscesses, abdominal pain, and chronic fatigue. Next slide. And this is why we exist as a foundation. So we exist because currently around 3.1 million Americans have IBD. So that equates to 1 in 100 people. So if you aren't a patient yourself, I'm sure that you know somebody that has IBD. Most frequent diagnoses occur between the ages of 15 and 35. And then there's a few stats about children with IBD in the US and newly diagnosed cases, and there is currently no cure. Next slide. So this is just, I'm not going to read it, but this is our vision and our mission. And of course, certainly it's around finding cures in our lifetime. So our purpose as a foundation is to do research to improve the quality of life for people living with IBD, and then ultimately to find a cure. Next slide. And then this might be a little bit outdated because we have consolidated some chapters recently, but we currently have around 34 chapters across the US. The nice thing about the state of Ohio is that we actually have 2 chapters. So we have a Northern Ohio chapter and we have a Southern Ohio chapter. As a part of the Northern Ohio chapter, we cover primarily Cleveland and Akron really well. And we're trying to really work more in the Youngstown, Sandusky communities as well. So we are a small team and rely very heavily on our volunteers. But we are technically the northern half of the state. And just lastly, about the local chapters, there are what I would say two arms of the chapter. So one is really around education, support, and advocacy, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then the other piece is the fundraising and volunteer engagement. Next slide. A little bit about the impact of our foundation. So currently we've invested more than $400 million in research. And the neat thing about being in the state of Ohio is over 15 million is invested back into the Buckeye State. So a lot of work being done at Cleveland Clinic and UH and at CASE. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Russ.
Hey, thanks, Amy. Yeah, I feel very fortunate to be here in Cleveland because of the focus of research into IBD at the clinic, at UH, and in CASE. It's a very good place to be. So as far as research, we're really trying to work for patients to overcome their hurdles and accelerate research into the discovery of new ways of treating patients. The typical IBD patient goes through a variety of therapeutics through the course of their lives, possibly surgeries. Up to 30% of people with the disease are not able to be treated with therapeutics, or they are treated with therapeutics, which then over time become less effective. They may move on to the next therapeutic, which works for a period of time, and then it becomes less effective. So we're working really hard to try to close those gaps for people so that if they do become diagnosed with the disease, there is options available for really lifetime treatment or cures. So the next slide. Oh, I guess, yeah. Yeah, so there's a number of research gaps that we've identified. Every 5 years, the foundation publishes a series of papers called Challenges in IBD. It just happens this is the year that we're redoing it. So the last one was in 2019. It'll be published in 2024. So that'll give you 5 years. And it really helps to identify what are the gaps in research. We then use those gaps to look at the funding for the next 5 years to try to fill those gaps, right? And help patients ultimately. So I've listed 3 here that really kind of cover a pretty good spectrum of what's going on. As I mentioned, therapeutic approaches to non-responders. It's very unfortunate that so many people have the disease and aren't able to be treated effectively over the course of the disease, especially this idea, and you can think about it from a mental perspective, that if you have, let's say, high cholesterol, right? People know what to give you there to lower your cholesterol, and once you're on that treatment, you're pretty much good. With IBD, you start off with one medication. It may or may not work. It may work for a while, and then it stops working. So it's a real problem, and so we're trying to figure out why that happens, why medicines stop working. Precision medicine is something, it's words that have become a big buzzword, but it's very appropriate for ID. Can we identify ways to say for a patient, this medicine will work for you, and it's going to work for you for a long period of time, as opposed to them having to go through a number of medications to try to find the one that's going to work. The other thing, and it's in the name of the disease, inflammatory bowel disease, but all the drugs that are on the market target very specific inflammatory mechanisms. And since they don't work, there's probably other things going on that aren't necessarily inflammation that need to be addressed. So we fund research to try to identify what are those novel mechanisms that need to be approached in order to fill the gap. Fibrosis is a really significant challenge for IBD. So fibrosis is the deposition of collagen within tissue in the body. In this case, it's within the GI tract. What that leads to is the GI tract restricting, and fibrotic strictures is the term for that, forming. And that then leads to digestion being affected because the food can't pass through those areas anymore, right? This typically leads to surgery, whereby those areas need to be removed from the intestine, and depending on the number and where they are, that then leads to removal of large portions of the intestine. So, and unfortunately, it's also the type of thing where it can happen more than once. So a patient will have the surgery, and then years down the road, they need another surgery because it's happened in a different area of the intestine. So there are no therapeutics on the market currently to prevent this or to dissolve them, basically. So we're currently involved with an initiative with a major pharmaceutical company where we're funding research specifically into why these strictures are forming and how we can resolve them in patients. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is this idea of early disease or flare detection. So a flare occurs in patients where their symptoms may be very low for a period of time, and then it flares up and they have very severe symptoms. We'd like to be able to help patients detect those, and so then maybe different treatments can be provided so that the flare doesn't occur, or at least it's lessened so that the patient doesn't have such a difficult time. Likewise, the disease can be very hard to detect, or at least to be diagnosed. Many patients go through multiple years of going to doctors and not being diagnosed. If there's a way to identify those patients earlier, obviously we can treat them earlier and hopefully lead to better outcomes. So the main points that we're trying to do there is to identify a reliable biomarker so that patients can be identified. This may be blood stool sampling, or maybe something like sweat or the breath that's produced by the body. Some really interesting things going on within the foundation to use those types of technologies. Ultrasound is another thing that's really evolving, and as opposed to people having to have endoscopies, now they can have ultrasounds, which are less invasive for sure than an endoscopy, and that may also help to be predictive in a way of saying we see something that may be developing into something more severe. And then lastly is the microbiome analysis. So microbiome is basically the collection of all the bacteria that are present in everybody. Like it or not, they're all over us. Our skin, on inside of us. Obviously, the GI tract has a very unique collection of bacteria. Changes daily. I mean, it's fascinating in terms of what goes on, but there are definitely indications that we can use the populations that are present to predict if a patient has IBD, if a patient is progressing in IBD. So doing that can really help patients in terms of early detection. Next slide. So we have a number of researcher opportunities present in the foundation. I'm not necessarily going to go through them all, but it goes from the very basic, a very early ability for students to be awarded research fellowship awards, where they can work in someone's lab or in someone's office or in some type of research for 10 weeks to both help in the research area, as well as becoming more interested and maybe leading to a career in IBD research, which would be fantastic. And it goes all the way up to career development awards, where researchers have been in this area for a long period of time, and we recognize that, and we want to continue to fund their research so that they can lead to new developments in the areas. So a large portion of our annual budget goes to funding researchers at different levels and in different areas, and that's one of our main drivers within the foundation. I think that's my last slide, if I'm not mistaken. So, yep.
For us. So I just wanted to share a little bit about our focus areas as an organization, because I think that it helps to put things in perspective. And actually, you can probably, Jaleese, you can probably just pull all these up at once and then go on to the next slide, because it'll talk a little bit more in detail about each of these 5 pillars. So these 5 pillars were derived from our strategic plan, which will be in its 3rd year in 2024. And these are kind of how we break down what we do as an organization. So Russ talked a lot about accelerating the pace of research. So of course, we're trying to break down some of these barriers around accessing data for physicians by having things like IBD Plexus, which is a huge database of biosamples that researchers can access, and similar IBD ventures. So this is really innovative products in the IBD space. So very dynamic and very exciting research ventures that we're working on now. Next slide.
And Amy, can I just mention, since I lead that group, IBD Ventures. So what this is it's an example of venture philanthropy. So we fund companies that are developing really novel products for IBD patients. This is in the areas of therapeutics, devices, diagnostics, and digital health. And what we really try to do is identify critical areas of need for those companies, fund them so they can get to the market faster and help patients. It's a venture philanthropy model. So whereas people hear a lot about venture capital, investing in new companies and getting a return in it, in our case, we do look for a return. So it is funding. It's not just grants. However, any returns will come back into the foundation to again further help patients in their areas of need. So we've been doing it for about 5 years. We've invested in 22 companies, and our hope is that in the next couple of years, we'll start seeing some of these companies hit in the market, which isn't unusual. It takes a long time, right? But we're really excited and very fortunate to be able to do this as a foundation.
Thanks, Russ. Much better than I could have said it. And we also have, if anybody's interested in any of these various projects, I'm happy to send out more information to distribute to the group. The second one is leveraging years of major foundational research investment. So focusing on the gut microbiome and how genetics play into IBD and patient's journey. Next slide. Catalyzing research, critical research in new domains. So this is doing research in areas of environmental triggers that might cause disease and the impact of both diet and stress. So we know that diet and stress can absolutely impact the way that a patient is feeling and how a patient may flare. And so a lot of research being done in this space as well. Next slide. And then sort of on the volunteer engagement side of things, inspiring and engaging patients and caregivers, because we are the country's largest IBD community. So just sharing that our research priorities with patients and making sure that they are involved in it and have a voice in it. We do a lot of work in the advocacy space. So we have an annual day on the Hill where we're voting on different pieces of legislature and we're involving our patients and physicians as well. Next slide. And then the last pillar is building resiliency and empowering patients. So just, again, increasing support and education. So we have a lot of live support groups. We do these in person and virtually across the country. So many chapters have in-person support groups. If they don't, we have virtual support groups that occur on a monthly basis. And we have a very large camp program. So with pediatric patients, they can access Camp Oasis. It's a regional camp. I believe we have 10 to 12 across the country. I can't remember the exact number. But this has been a really cool way for patients to feel more connected to people their age when they're diagnosed. Camp can be in person or virtual. So we do have a virtual option for those that aren't well enough to attend in person or don't feel as comfortable. And then, of course, shared decision-making programs. So ensuring that patients feel like they can advocate for themselves when it comes to their healthcare and their health journey. Next slide.
Okay, so just switching gears a little bit, we wanted to talk about how underrepresented communities are impacted by IBD. And if you could actually go back to the other slide. There we go. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this space is really vast and broad and gets into a lot of health equity. And we could talk about that all day within just this community. But so I wanted to acknowledge that with what I'm going to talk about, we're really just focusing in on one area, and it's not going to cover all of what diversity really is, right? So I'm going to be talking I'm going to be talking only about race and ethnicity and kind of how the things that we're some of the things that we're doing to approach how that is reflected within our research, but it doesn't cover the breadth of what we're doing as a foundation for underrepresented communities, nor does it cover all of those areas of diversity. But so to get into this, Amy mentioned earlier the stat around 1 in 100 Americans that have IBD. So we, the foundation actually published a study earlier this year that solidified that statistic. And another thing that was covered within it was prevalence as it relates to race and ethnicity. And so what was found was that the highest prevalence is among the white community by and large, and that that community is 7 times higher. It has a prevalence of 7 times higher than the Black African American community, 6 times higher than the Hispanic Latino community, and 21 times higher than the Asian American community. So those are drastically different. But like we know in any area of research, there's a lot more that needs to be looked at and uncovered to really accurately depict this racial prevalence. So when we think about that, for example, we know that some of the limitations to this study were really things like social determinants of health. That's something we didn't really take into consideration with these prevalence rates, and access to quality care. We also didn't think we didn't address inequities and biases within the healthcare system. And so all of those things really play a role in how underrepresented communities are reflected in this research, but also just research overall. So I wanted to call that out, and you can go to the next slide. And the other really interesting thing is, one reason we have focused around race and ethnicity is because overall we know that the incidence of IBD in America are increasing. And sorry, you can go back one. Yeah, thank you. We know that overall the incidence are increasing, but it's even more so among racial and ethnic groups. So we have a study, there was a study that was done and looked at incident rates between the 1970s and 2010, so over a 40-year period. And those incidents increased among the white community by 39%, but in non-white communities and people of color, they increased by 135%, which is, obviously a huge difference. And so this just makes it even more important that we start addressing these gaps in appropriate representation and consideration of all avenues of patient research and patient care. You can go to the next slide, please. And so just kind of getting back to some of these other areas that impact research and how underrepresented communities are represented and how they're cared for. Just wanted to call out, these are examples. This is not an exhaustive list of the things that impact this, but just wanted to provide a little bit more information around it. One is that we know in terms of randomized controlled trials, African Americans specifically have a very low patient enrollment rate in RCTs. And there are a lot of things that go into that as well. One is like a poor understanding of what the trials are and kind of, why randomized controlled trials are the gold standard of research. And then you can think about things like access to the academic center that's putting that on. Things like parking or public transportation, play a big role into that as well. So when we think about that, we think about, okay, so if we have a low rate of underrepresented people within our randomized controlled trials, what does that mean for the effectiveness of our therapies that are currently out there? So that's one area to think about. Another is we also know that communities of color are often underrecognized and underdiagnosed in this area. So that can lead to longer periods of being untreated and increased risk for complications. So all of this just kind of plays into that equity piece and how they're being cared for. You can go to the next slide, please. So with all that to say, there's so much work to be done, a lot to address in terms of inequities that are just within this field, right? But we are really committed to trying to evolve our organization's embodiment of diversity and inclusion and how that shows up in the actual work that we do. And so one thing I wanted to mention was this grant that we recently received from the CDC and is kind of underway right now as of October of this year. And it's in partnership with the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And it's really all about, it's a multi-year project. I believe it's 5 years. And it's all about identifying the barriers and improving access of care for the Black African-American community of IBD. And so if you want to learn more about that, we're very excited to have that underway. Again, it literally just kicked off, but if you want to see more information about that, I've linked to it here on our website. We have just like a press release about it. And that's all I've got.
Thanks, Sarah. I know that we're close on time, so I just wanted to share a little bit about the local chapter. So as I had mentioned before, we serve all of Northern Ohio, so this is a little bit outdated. So Northwest and Northeast Ohio. Our office is located in Independence. We have lots and lots of materials and resources for newly diagnosed patients, for physicians, for caregivers, for siblings and family members of people with IBD. Our staff is 2.5 people. We have a local board of 8. Our annual budget is just under $1 million, which is, again, wonderful that a lot of this fundraising is reinvested back into the Cleveland Clinic and UH and some of the local healthcare facilities here. And in our territory alone, there is about 35,000 patients. Next slide. And these are annual events that occur within the chapter. So we have a walk, and that's held at Edgewater Park every year. We usually have about 500 people in attendance, and it occurs in May. We don't have a date yet for any of these programs next year. We also have a patient education program. It is a full day Saturday program. We're currently working on the location. We're trying to make it more accessible for all patients. It used to be in Independence, but we're working on that. It's probably about 20 physicians that speak about different topics. There's a lot of breakout groups. It's very interactive. We have a golf outing in August. We have our annual gala in usually in November. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, we have virtual support groups as well. And I think that concludes our formal part of the presentation. So I guess at this point, we can open it up for questions.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Apologies for the technical glitches. I did not have my finger when the slides were jumping back and forth, but the information, I hope that did not detract from that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Do we have any questions from the group? And please feel free to put those in the chat. I see someone with their hand. Ivanka?
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you all for your presentation. Delise, thank you for inviting me. So I want to go back to, there was a slide that talked about the demographics around Crohn's and colitis and irritable bowel syndrome in the African American community. And so I come from a family that has a long history of Crohn's and Crohn's disease. And so we found out by accident because one of the things that Crohn's disease has done not a great job of is alerting to the African American community of their risk. And that's because early on, and I know 10 years ago, they only talked about it as being something that was disproportionately impacted European communities. And so if you were African American, that wasn't something that they talked about, even in doctor's appointments. And so my niece, who is, I think she's 33 years old, went for years in pain, in absolute pain, where she would have to be admitted to the hospital for long stays. And then finally, she found a doctor here in Cleveland. She was in South Carolina. She found a doctor here, and then the doctor retired. I guess there are not a lot of doctors also that handle this within our populations. And so just understanding how much she went through, that she diagnosed herself. Like, she went to medical school because she had something that had been causing her a lifetime of pain. And every time she went to the doctor, it was dismissed. And so I think that it's not so much that around African Americans not wanting to be involved in clinical studies, is African Americans don't even know about Crohn's disease because they have been failed to be diagnosed by their physicians that they have Crohn's disease. And so what they'll tell them is, you don't have this, a risk factor for it because you're Black. And so she was told that. My grandmother, who just recently passed away at 92 and a half, she was told that also. You're an African American woman. And so, but our DNA says otherwise. And so I think that we have to be honest with the African American community and let them know their risk, and not say, well, African Americans, won't come to doctor's appointments, or they're, they're not participating in clinical trials, because you can't participate in something that you don't know is disproportionately impacting you, or that you don't even know that you have. And so the other thing is, I saw your study at Alabama, the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And that's not a traditionally school that participates around the African American community. As a matter of fact, I just left Alabama, and the African American community in Alabama don't even work with the University of Alabama. There are 14 HBCUs in Alabama, 14 historically Black universities that are in Alabama. And one of them is Alabama State University, that has a long history of work with the community. And so it might be, that you're not going about it through the right university, because you have to work with universities that the community knows. And when you talk to the community in Alabama, that's not the universities that they talk about. The universities that the African American community talk about are the universities that are more closely aligned with their communities. And those are those 14 HBCUs that were created at the end of, slavery through the Freedmen's Bureau. So, and Alabama has a long history around these HBCUs and their alignment with the community. So I think that that's the other thing too. I think we work with non-African American serving universities, and we expect to get results. And we're gonna still end up with the same thing, is that African Americans won't participate, and that's because African Americans have never been welcomed into some of the universities that we work with. So that's my comments about the presentation. But I appreciated the information, because it does disproportionately impact us. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I'd love to follow up with you as well, just to continue the conversation, because I hear you. I think over time, the position has shifted around like who we are communicating to predominantly. And we've definitely realized the need to outreach more to communities of color, just because of like the stat that I put up around incident rates increasing so drastically among communities of color over the years. And so we do have, and I didn't go into everything that's kind of underway within the foundation to try to address, education from a patient and healthcare provider and caregiver standpoint. But I think your perspective is, of course, like very, very valid and right on. The actual submission of the grant predates me, so I don't have a lot of information on how that was decided in terms of who they partnered with. But I know that the goal of that, I think I appreciate everything you said around, HBCUs and thinking about that moving forward. But I also just wanted to mention, I know part of like the community outreach that they're going to be doing is going to be in conjunction with a lot of local local organizations that are close with the Black African American community in Birmingham specifically. Again, I'm not really sure why this was focused in that area or with that university, but I appreciate all your comments on that. And I'd love to follow up with you after this, if that's okay.
As Jaleese knows, that is perfectly fine. I just, I think, and even here, we have a large percentage of African Americans in Greater Cleveland that, are being diagnosed with gastro issues when they actually have either irritable bowel syndrome or they may have Crohn's disease, and that's because nobody's taking it any further, and particularly, looking at what COVID did for the gastro system, looking at gastritis and some of the things that are disproportionately impacting Black people who had COVID and who disproportionately had COVID. And now they're having all of these stomach issues, and they're having the stomach issues because they were already there. Like it was something that was already there, and now COVID just made it worse. And so we really, really have to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to address the long COVID and the issues around Crohn's disease and the African Americans of community of people who are being diagnosed with stomach issues and not what's actually wrong with them, which is Crohn's disease. Because doctors are still telling people that because you are Black, that you do not have Crohn's disease. I'm telling y'all, doctors are still telling Black folks that they do not have Crohn's disease because Crohn's disease is for Europeans only.
I've heard that a lot. Yes. Well, I also think Amy would be a great resource for you just on like a local level as well, in terms of the chapter that's there, and just thinking about that from a local level too. But no, I appreciate all of what you've said. So thank you.
Yeah, and Ivanka, thank you for sharing that. And as I was talking about in terms of diagnostics and just patients in general, I definitely can empathize with what you're talking about. And unfortunately, it's true for many populations of patients and for this disease. And so if we can get better first, you're right, we need to make doctors aware of the occurrence in the Black community, but we also then, if we have tests that are better able to predict it, or blood test, which can go in your annual physical, right? You get tested for cholesterol and everything else. If there's something that can identify a possibility of a patient for Crohn's or colitis, that would be a great thing, a great barrier to break, because it happens a lot for patients, and that's something a barrier we want to remove.
Thank you, Ivanka. Thank you, Russell and Sarah. So we do have a question in the chat. While the incidence and prevalence of IBD in Asian populations were relatively lower than those in Western countries, they appear to be gradually increasing. Any plan to include Asian American, Pacific Islanders, the AAPI community?
Yeah, and what I'll say is, when we sort of started down this path of how we are addressing these issues with underrepresented groups, we had to take a step back and not, our CEO loves to say this, like boil the ocean, and be really thoughtful and have data around where we approach things first. So that's why we have predominantly looked at initiatives that have involved the Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino communities. But there is underway. So, and when I say that, I mean in terms of community engagement, the patients that we're trying to particularly reach, and the programs around that. Excuse me. And they're in the works right now of taking our existing programs around those two communities and trying to expand those out into the AAPI community. I don't have a ton of information on that, but I know that that is kind of like the next step that's in the works. If they're, would love to be connected with anyone that has a resource that links the AAPI community with IBD, because I know that it's just important for us to also be talking to the community in a lot of different ways. So I'm very open to if people want to reach out to me and I can help make connections to the right people that are ushering that work along within the organization. But that was a long way of saying, yes, it's something that is currently underway and on the horizon. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions, comments?
Hi, this is Cassandra. Oh, go ahead.
No, Cassandra, go ahead.
I just had a question about the research. You mentioned your precision medicine studies, and I work on kidney precision medicine studies, and I was just wondering if you find it easier to enroll participants when you get into precision medicine instead of just like general, join this study just because.
Yeah, so I'll say any type of clinical trial for IBD is a difficult road to walk down, whether it's for diagnostics or for treatments, and partially that goes back to this problem of patients going through this cycle of therapeutic treatments. So if you're trying to identify patients for a new therapeutic, the exclusion criteria can be so hard that you can't find any patients that join the trial. We see some of the same things in terms of when we're looking to basically identify, come up with a way of identify patients that are appropriate for a given treatment. So if you want to look at the next biologic or a given biologics, you may have to look at patients that have or haven't responded to earlier drugs. So it really narrows the pool down. Probably the biggest pool that we can work with, and maybe the best ones to work in the precision medicine approach, are those patients that are very early in their treatment, so that they haven't gone through that evolving treatments into the biologics. And so it can be really difficult to identify the right population of people to look at. I mean, right now, really, a lot of the work is being done more preclinically, I would say, to identify those markers or genetics for people who would respond to a given treatment, and then expand that into the clinical trial world.
Okay, thanks.
All right. And Ivanka, did you have another question or comment?
I put one of them in the a couple of them in the chat. One of them was about Agent Inc. The one in Cleveland and in Akron should be on the radar if they're looking to work with Northeast Ohio. And then that many in the Asian community are also being misdiagnosed because of the bias in medical treatment and diagnosis. So we see that in their communities also, of going in for certain things and also being told, you don't have this because you are not a white European. So therefore you do not have this. But maybe that this study, since they're looking at a study, should also be in talks with the Recover study and ask Recover if they're actually testing people for Crohn's disease that are coming in and complaining about stomach issues. Like, are they testing them to rule out the fact that they may have Crohn's disease or irritable bowel syndrome? Because I think that may be a big thing that I just thought about today, that may be something that's missing from that study, because we have not yet one single time talked about Crohn's disease or irritable bowel syndrome in any of the Recover studies, even though we're talking about stomach issues.
Yeah, I will put, so irritable bowel syndrome is something totally different, right? It's its own disease, and they are confused for sure, right? The people who may think or may be diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome that have Crohn's and vice versa, but they are two separate diseases.
Oh, I realize that, but what I'm saying is we're not talking about any of them in the Recover study. So what we're talking about is people are coming in with stomach issues, where they may have other issues and say, every time I try to eat something, I'm really sick. And nobody has, not one single time in any of these meetings that I've gone to for the last 2 years, have talked about the correlation that it may possibly be that the person has not been diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And so maybe that having a test as part of the RECOVER study to rule out Crohn's disease would be beneficial to these hundreds of thousands of people who have been long haulers that are dealing with stomach issues over the last 2 years, and for some 3 years.
Absolutely. We have another comment in the chat. The first AAPI Health and Social Determinants of Health report was just released with the support of Cuyahoga County Board of Health, and this individual will be happy to share and collaborate. I do have her email, so I can pass that along. My question would be, what is the best way, or how have you worked with local researchers on any projects? Like, so CASE, maybe people from university hospitals, Cleveland Clinic, the VA, and Metro Health. And we name those because those are our partners on our grant. I'm just curious for those who may be wanting to kind of figure out the best way to approach. And I know that there was that slide with the opportunities as well.
Yeah, I mean, so there's, and I think these go out to a lot of different universities, but whenever there's a request for proposals or something related to a particular grant, a new grant or a new initiative, that gets emailed out. And, you know, as I mentioned, there are many physicians at the clinic, for example, that are already on research grants, are part of the scientific advisory council for the foundation and involved in other ways. Same thing with UH, these serve as reviewers for grants. So, you know, part of what we rely on is kind of word of mouth, right? That the people that are involved in those ways talk to their colleagues and let them know about this. But a lot of it depends on the university people reaching out to the foundations and inquiring about the programs that we have. But we're always glad to talk in this type of situation to let them know we have these things. So, you know, please come. And Amy, I don't know if the chapters do any type of that education or research discussions.
Not particularly, but we do locally. We have a healthcare professional engagement committee. So we have a team of healthcare professionals from Cleveland, mostly from Cleveland Clinic, UH, and Metro, that meet quarterly, and we kind of talk through some of this, what Russ was talking about. And then this is the committee that also plans the patient education program. There's a lot of opportunity this year with this committee, particularly because we are working on some pilot programs within the DEI space in Cleveland, because and I had mentioned earlier, we're looking at a new location. So again, trying to make programs more accessible. So if anyone on this call, or if anyone knows of anyone that would benefit from being in communication with the local chapter, please do not hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. That's really exciting. Okay. Any closing thoughts from anyone? If not, then maybe our presenters might have some marching orders for our research community, or just maybe not marching orders, but some final thoughts, and then we'll close.
Well, I would just say I really appreciate this time, because like I said, my local team is a team of 2.5 people. And so we rely very, very heavily on volunteers to help our community understand that we exist, that we try to be the best liaison between patients and providers as we can. But because we are such a small community, it's so important that we continue to spread awareness and spread information about what we do and what we'd hope to plan to do in the future. So thank you for taking 50 minutes on a Friday afternoon to learn more about us.
Thank you so much, Amy, Sarah, and Russell. We have definitely learned a lot and look forward to future research collaborations, because there is a ton of opportunity, as we've learned today. So everyone, we hope you have a great weekend. And this is our final talk for the year, but please join us next year as we continue this learning process and really just help each other. All right.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.